Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus minisodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive minisode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm your hostess, Lori Adams Brown, and you are listening to episode 37. All right, everyone. It's the woman you've all been waiting to hear from, Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Her book is releasing today, and she has already had so much attention around this book. I know you are all very excited, and I'm happy to have this podcast edited and released to you today as her book is releasing. Dr. Beth Allison Barr has a doctorate from the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's a professor of history and associate dean of graduate studies at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. She specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. She's the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of Christians for Biblical Equality. She's written for Christianity Today, The Washington Post, and Religious News Service. She's a regular contributor to The Anxious Bench, which is a popular Patheos website on Christian history. And she has recently been featured on NPR, so I'm sure some of you heard her there. She is a delight to speak with and talk to, and her book about biblical womanhood is her own journey, going from understanding the Bible through the lens of a complementarian view as a Southern Baptist, and her husband was a Southern Baptist pastor for many years, and just their own journey of understanding what they were reading in the Bible, as well as what she was understanding throughout church history, and realizing some of those things didn't match, and just her own personal journey of that, of understanding what she believes to be actually what the Bible is saying and what church history is pointing us toward. And also, she has a lot of really some crazy and very interesting stories in her book related to, her own studies in church history, especially the medieval period. So the title of her book is The Making of Biblical Womanhood: How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. Biblical womanhood, as she says, is this belief that God designed women to be submissive wives, virtuous mothers, and joyful homemakers, which pervades a lot of North American Christianity. And it impacts our career choices, to roles in churches, relationship dynamics, and just this belief shapes everyday lives of our evangelical women here in the United States in particular. And yet, her discovery and her understanding over the years is that biblical womanhood isn't biblical. This whole concept that we throw around, biblical womanhood that we hear about, is actually, in fact, not what the Bible is saying. And so this whole book was born in a series of very definable moments in history, including in her own life as she understood things. So she goes into beyond the Greek grammar into the realm of church history, the ancient, medieval, and modern, and to show us that this belief is definitely not divinely ordained, but it's a product of human civilization that continues to creep into the church. She is smart, she's knowledgeable, she loves the church. She's been a Baptist pastor's wife for many years, and her own journey toward seeing the church be true to what the Bible says, and be honest about what church history has really actually been like. So I am thrilled and honored and so excited to welcome to today's show Dr. Beth Allison Barr. Hello, Dr. Barr. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Yes, I'm super excited. Oh, your book is getting a lot of buzz in my Twitter and my Instagram feeds, so it's just awesome to meet you face to face. But some of my listeners already know who you are, I'm sure, but there are probably many who don't know who you are. So maybe just give us a little introduction to yourself and your family, your background, and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, so my name is Beth Allison Barr, and I grew up in the SBC church. I married an SBC pastor 10 days before I started a PhD program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And then I am currently now an associate professor actually, I just got promoted. I'm now a professor of history at Baylor. Funny, it just happened last week. Thank you. And an associate dean in the graduate school. And my husband is still a pastor. However, not in the way we originally thought. He got fired 4 years ago over the issue of women in ministry. And that incident really changed our lives in a lot of ways and made us realize that we couldn't be silent anymore about what was going on with women and gender roles in the evangelical church. And so we've been speaking out since then. And the Making a Biblical Womanhood is sort of my life story of why I decided to speak out and why I think that biblical womanhood or complementarianism isn't actually biblical. So
Yes, well, you are a perfect fit for our Women in the Church podcast, because I know a lot of people are listening that are, some are complementarian, some are egalitarian, mutualist, some are kind of somewhere along there, some are just trying to figure it out, and some have, not even Christians, so that's fine too. But in this conversation, I'm really excited because just the issue of women in the church, it touches on a lot of issues just in our society as a whole around the world. And being a historian is really exciting because when in reading your book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I love how you do have this autobiographical portion of it, which to me just shows your love of history, even your own history, as it plays into this conversation. And I do just firmly believe that stories are so powerful when it comes to life change. And when we look at church history, um, I think so many women and men are longing for her story, not just his story. I mean, I remember when I was in seminary and we read Justo Gonzalez's books in church history, which are awesome. I really loved it. And I remember just even the story for me of like Perpetua has just stuck in my soul for years. I remember being in Indonesia and Singapore. Some of my Muslim friends had become Christians. And I just said, there are women in our history who have given up everything for Jesus, who's really worth it. And I think the stories of women in the church are so powerful. My first question for you, though, is around the issue of historically about patriarchy. So I lived in Indonesia in a city for a while where the Ramayana ballet was really kind of huge. And I know that throughout all of these, religious histories, there's a point in time when patriarchy kind of began. So talk about the history of patriarchy and how it began.
So it's funny you said the Ramayana. When I first wrote my first draft of the first chapter, which is the creation of patriarchy, I had 3 texts, ancient texts, that I wanted to include in it. And I realized that I was going to lose my audience really fast if I included all 3 of those texts because it was just too much history. So with great regret, I cut the Ramayana. So it was actually one of them that I had. And when I teach the Epic of Gilgamesh in my ancient history classes, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is the text that I used. And primarily I used it because I thought my audience would be more familiar with it because of it overlaps with some of the early Christian history. So the Ramayana, though, is the text that I teach immediately after I teach the Epic of Gilgamesh. So one of the themes that we talk about is the treatment of women. How here we have these two ancient cultures that are really separated. They don't overlap. We don't have, this is the ancient world, and so there still is. While people are traveling a lot more than what we think they are in our, we don't realize that ancient people traveled all over the world, but still the contact between them was significantly limited, and very, not very much there. When Alexander the Great made it to the north part of India and Pakistan, it was like the end of the world. So the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Ramayana are created in separate areas by separate cultures, but yet the way that they treat women is surprisingly similar.
Mm,
This focus on women as sort of being the supporting actors in the story, the focus on women's primary role being how they tell their husband's story. That's really what they do. That's what we see with Rama and Sita. Sita's primary role is being Rama's um, partner,
yeah.
and in fact, and that's her only importance, which is why we get the whole, sati at the end, where where she throws herself in the purifying fires
Yeah.
to prove her worth.
Mhm.
And the same thing in the Epic of Gilgamesh, women are woven throughout the story. And for those of you unfamiliar, I got excited hearing the Ramayana because these are the texts I teach all the time. But if you're unfamiliar with the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's a really fun story. It's an ancient Sumerian story, and it's about a god king named Gilgamesh, who essentially learns a really hard lesson. And that is that he can't live forever, and that focusing only on himself is not good for the people he rules over. And so but it's a hard lesson that he learns, and he's pretty much a bully throughout most of the story. And so women are really important characters in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but their primary importance is just coming alongside the men, fulfilling the needs of the men, doing what the men say, and focusing on bearing children and essentially being sort of wives. Those are their primary roles. And as a historian, it's really striking to me that here we have these two separate cultures, very ancient cultures, that have no contact between them, yet their approach to women, that women, because of the way they are born, because of their bodies, that women are under the authority of men and should always be under the authority of men, and that women are not intellectually capable as men are. Women are not able to lead in the same ways that men are. And what also is striking to me is that if we look at modern evangelicalism, especially teachings about complementarianism, what we find is that their attitudes towards women, that women should naturally are created to be under male authority, that something about their bodies makes them unable to lead, that their focus should be, because they can bear children, their focus should be on bearing children. Which is not, men get to do a whole lot of other things, but
Right.
women's focus should be because of the way their bodies are made. This, to me, from a historical perspective, looks absolutely no different from the story that we see in ancient India, and the story, or Southeast Asia, and the story that we see in ancient Sumeria. And so that, I think, should give us pause to think about complementarianism. Because if Christians are called to be different, if we are called to treat women differently with dignity and respect, then why does the way that we treat them look just like these ancient non-Christian cultures? Why do we treat women as less than men? Um, Despite the fact that we are Christian. So is that helpful?
Yeah, excellent, excellent answer on that. And I have the same question. I mean, especially for those of us who are, listening right now, who are either Muslim or Jewish or Christian, we go back to our, creation story where God, the Most High God, made a man and a woman in God's image, and it was very good. And there was, a mutuality in this creation. And it wasn't until the sin happened that then suddenly we see something bad happening. So
Right.
we're living in the fall, instead of trying to live in God's original creation, original design for us, that we're on purpose trying to create systems that aren't what God ever intended for us to have.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. That is one, I think that's one of the reasons for those of you who are in evangelical churches, complementarian churches, one of the things that you may have been taught is that women's subordination predates the fall. And the reason, this is actually a very new teaching. It's something that has come up relatively recently. There are a few historical parallels, but really it's a pretty modern thing. And the reason people began to teach that was because all of the evidence, and in fact, the biblical account shows that patriarchy is part of the curse. It is when humanity sinned against God and tried to take and God said, not that God wanted this to happen, but God said, because you have done this is what's going to happen. The work will be hard to earn your own food, and there is going to be this tension between the woman and the man. And the woman is going, her desire will be for her husband, and he will rule over her, not because God wanted it that way, but because we broke his creation. And both of these things, this world where we now have to work for our labor, is hard. It means that children throughout the world don't have enough to eat. It means that there's difference in economy and what people, the money that people have and their ability to live a life without having to worry about poverty and without having to worry about whether this precarity that comes along with most of the world. I mean, I live in, America, which our ability to live is so much above that we just don't realize how hard poverty and in fact lots of America, though, this is the thing too, is that there's a lot of poverty in the US as well,
Yeah.
and we don't realize how this is part of the curse. This is because of what we did, the sin. And so the question is I find it really ironic that we understand that we should fight against poverty. We understand that we should try to feed children. We understand that we should try to create a world where people can work and earn a living. So why don't we fight against patriarchy? Why do we
Yeah.
continue to support a system that also was broken, that was created, that happened because we sinned? And in fact, if you look at patriarchy itself, what is it? What's embedded in the system? It says that that men will, because of their male bodies, that they will consider themselves to be superior to
Mhm.
women, and women will not essentially that women's curse is to be in this system. And my question is, why do we accept that curse and
Yeah.
say that's how we're supposed to live when we realize that it's the fault of the broken world? And so in complementarians, to try to, because they realize that if patriarchy is a result of the fall, then they can't claim it as the ideal for the church. So they've started this new theology where they essentially say, oh, it had to predate the fall. It has to be a part of God's original creation. The problem is that there is no biblical evidence for this.
Right.
They changed some things to try to support it, and in fact, their sort of last ditch effort was trying to write hierarchy into the Trinity. That their argument that because Jesus is subordinate to God the Father, wives should always be subordinate to their husbands. The problem with this is that's heresy.
Yeah, we learned that in church history. That was an early heresy they got rid
It was, and so but it just shows us that it shows us how true the story, Genesis is at the beginning, where it pretty much predicts what is going to happen between men and women throughout history because of our sin. So it's really hard for me to come away from reading those early Genesis stories and not understand that patriarchy, the oppression of women,
Yeah.
is a result of sin.
Yeah. And as we move throughout, I mean, you're a historian about women's history and that kind of thing as well. But like, and so we're not talking about this in terms of two theologians or anything like that, although I've had some on the podcast already
Right.
in the series. But as we go, even just through the history that we see in, the Old Testament or the Torah, or, my Muslim friends call the Taurat, we see these
Yeah.
stories about the people of Israel wanting a king. And
Mhm.
so, like, explain to us this human need for structure and power and desire for a human king and how that impacted women as well.
I'm so glad you brought that up. That's one of the things that I keep telling because, women often come to me. I've heard so many stories from women lately who are just reach out and just tell me what their life has been like. And one of the things I hear over and over again, and I actually heard this too, and this is what in churches, when women start asking why they can't teach, why they can't preach, why they can't be on stage to pray, often the retort that we get is, well, why aren't you satisfied with the portion God has given you? Why are you trying to grab for power? Why are you trying, essentially this that something is wrong with us trying to grab for power. They see it as a power grab. What's funny to me about that is that this is exactly what they are doing.
Yeah.
This trying to maintain their own power. And if we look at history, the nature of civilization, the beginning of civilization, on the one hand, structure is necessary because humans don't work well together. And if you look philosophically throughout history, one of the things people have tried to figure out is how can we actually live together in a society that works, because humans are always fighting each other. And so one of the way, I mean, you can even think about Confucius in
Yeah.
ancient China. We teach a lot. This is he came up with and what Confucius came up with. He said everybody needs to accept their place. That there
Mm,
are places. Your listeners who are from Southeast Asia and from India will understand with the caste system. This is also part of this type of, we have to create these structures.
yeah.
And if everybody knows their role and if everybody does their thing, then it helps keep order in society. On the one hand, this is true, but it is also because of this broken world in which we live. And so the problem, of course, the problem isn't having structure and having leadership. The problem is how we decide who gets to lead. And when that decision, patriarchy, the way that decision is made is that some people, simply because of how they are born, are innately able to lead over other people. And this is a constant pattern that we see throughout history. Since you've mentioned it, now my mind is thinking on ancient India and all the classes I've taught in that too. But this is exactly what we see with what they used to call the Aryan invasion, which we know really didn't happen the way that they claimed it happened. But nonetheless, what we saw was people beginning to migrate to the subcontinent of India, moving in and taking power over the native inhabitants and arguing that they had the right to rule because of who they were,
Wow.
and they begin to trace their lineage to their gods. And this is the same system that we see in ancient Mesopotamia. This is the same system that we see in the US when the European explorers, imperialism, went over and took over the lands from Native Americans. Um, so this desire to think that we have the right to rule and be over other people is part of the human condition. And
Yeah.
history shows this pattern. History also shows us that this pattern always has a dark underside, has I try not to use the word dark, but it has a not good
Yeah.
underside. It leads to oppression and abuse and slavery,
Yeah.
slavery of other people groups, slavery of women, slavery of anybody who we consider to be under ourselves. So I'm
Yeah.
doing broad brush here. I got excited when I started thinking about how international your audience might be, where I can make
Yeah.
some of these big connections.
Of course. No, and it all makes so much sense. And I think this is why for me, and I often think of what it would have been like to be one of the women around Jesus. You would
Oh,
really be willing to just give everything up for a man like that. After
yes.
so many generations of this kind of history around the world, this man
Yes.
flipping hierarchy, who's even, I mean, in multiple situations, looking, losing his own reputation just to even talk to a woman. But he's not just talking to them, he's elevating them, he's empowering them, he's giving them firsthand knowledge of his resurrected body visually to share that with other people. I mean, he's saying, don't be in the kitchen, actually be here and be my disciple and learn from me. I
Yes.
mean, yeah, it's just crazy stuff. I think I would have been one of those women that said, forget everything else. I'm following this man, because if all of human history had told women that they were, junior partners at best,
Right.
this is
Yeah.
radical. Yeah.
It's absolutely radical. And I think, one of my favorite authors is a woman named Dorothy L. Sayers, and she's also a very strong Christian in the early 20th century. And she has this amazing statement that she has at the end of one of her essays. I think it's The Human, Not Quite Human. And at the end of it, she has this thing. She's like, women were first at the cradle and first at the cross. And it's because this man was, and I'm paraphrasing her, this man was more than they could have ever imagined, that no other man had ever treated them this way, as not that they were women. In fact, she has this great phrase where she said Jesus never belittled women for being feminine, for being female, but at the same time, he also like allowed them to have authority because they were female. And so essentially, he didn't use their femininity against them.
Yeah.
He treated them as they were human. And that's what we really see in the history of the world. We see that people try to separate out other people by difference. And this is how we organize our societies and how we create structures. And I'll put out there, because this is such a hot topic in the US, I'm not a socialist. I'm okay with structure and organization. As I said, in fact, I love democracy. But remember we have to remember that our innate desire, our innate inclination is to make some people more eligible to lead than other people. And that's not a Christian inclination. It's
No.
something we need to fight against.
Yeah.
And so anyway, so I mean Jesus is absolutely radical for women.
Yeah.
It's and we miss it
We do.
because of complementarian teachings.
We do, absolutely. And I do love Dorothy Sayers, and I've read that passage a million times, and she's awesome.
Oh,
And I know there are many other women in church history that probably a lot of people don't know about. So I do want to get into that.
in fact, I
But let's
have
talk about
her.
how,
I keep her. She's on my
oh, yes.
desk. So.
um, so, Jesus was radical, but Paul was too. And a lot of people miss this. I love Cynthia Long Westfall's book, Paul and Gender, and many people have written on this. But how misunderstood he gets, and how Paul doesn't even make sense to me at all in the complementarian view. But I'd love for you to unpack, just explaining how complementarianism is actually sort of increasing in certain circles, and it's being portrayed as something that has existed this way for like 2,000 years of church history. And maybe even, Paul he's quoting some of the Roman world when he's talking about women asking their husbands at home and how that's
Yes.
been misunderstood.
Gosh, there's a whole lot there in that question. So why don't I start with Paul? And indeed, complementarianism is increasing. One of the reasons it's increasing is because of the spread of the ESV. And I know I'm going to get a lot of pushback because a lot of people, in fact, I've been told before that the ESV is the extra special version.
Oh, wow.
That in some ways it's almost getting the equivalent of sort of KJV only people in some circles.
Wow.
But the ESV was, they call it, the translators of it call it, they say they are unapologetically complementarian.
Right.
And so their whole perspective, in fact, the primary things that they changed, or some of the primary things that they emphasized in it, was to emphasize gender roles and to emphasize that women shouldn't be leaders. So if you use the ESV, you just need to be aware of that,
Right.
that was their goal. And that's what they
Yeah.
were trying to do. And so one of the things that they do, if you look at Paul, and how they change the language in Paul. Like, for example, Paul, one of the reasons that you can never biblically argue that Paul made a blanket statement against women teaching or preaching in church is Romans 16. Because Romans 16 lists 10 or 11 women. It lists more women than men who are in ministry positions, and it names their ministry positions. And in the early church, they didn't have pastors. They didn't have, a lot of the roles we have today, we've made up.
Right.
Doesn't mean they're not important, but
Right.
they're not biblical.
Right.
I mean, it's just funny to me. People are like, we're a first century church. And I'm like, no, you're not. But, the roles that they had in the early church, where they had apostle, they had disciples, they had deacons. And Romans 16 has women in all of those roles,
Yep.
as well as women leading house churches.
Yep.
Essentially being a pastor, if you want to, call it that.
Right.
And the only way that you can get around that, if you're a complementarian, is by covering it up in Romans 16.
Yeah.
And in fact, that is what they have done. A good example of that is Junia.
Yeah.
And Junia in Romans 16:7, throughout almost all of church history, Bible translations have translated her as an apostle, who was prominent among the apostles. She was an apostle. Um, and in the 19th century, there was a couple of others. Martin Luther is actually kind of famous for this too, but nobody listened to Martin Luther at the time about this translation of Romans 16:7. But in the 19th century, um, people started doing that. They started emphasizing that women shouldn't be leaders and teachers and preachers. And so Junia actually she becomes transgendered. She gets translated as a man,
Yeah.
Junius. The only reason for it is because she is named an apostle. The ESV today, and I actually had a podcast somewhere where I think I confused the ASV and the ESV on this, and I'm like, there's just too many translations. But anyway, but the ESV does record her as Junius, but as Junia, but it has a footnote that says some translations say Junius. The only reason they say Junius is because they started doing it in the 19th century. Okay, it's not
Yeah.
it's not like a biblical conversation. And then they also, instead of saying that she is prominent among the apostles, they change that preposition and they say that she is noteworthy to the apostles, that she's well known to the apostles, which means that instead of being an apostle, she becomes just a woman that they knew. And this intentional changing of biblical language, it doesn't affect the gospel message.
Right.
That's one of the things I want to get across. By God's message, it's amazing how consistently it comes through, no matter what translation you use.
Yeah.
But translations change the little stories. And the little stories about women have been changed in the Bible by translators who do not think women should lead.
Yeah.
And that has led to the flourishing of complementarianism and people thinking that complementarianism is biblical.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does
Well,
that
let's
help?
yes,
Yeah.
no, that's very helpful. You hit all the major points that I was hoping you would hit. Let's talk a little bit about because you have a historian on the podcast today, so I'd love to know because I know you've written about this and talked about this. What happened to women in the post-plague society in Europe that changed the household, in relationship to the state kingdoms and how women were viewed after that?
Yeah. So in the medieval world, and I'm a medieval historian, and if you think roughly, I'm a medieval European historian. So let me emphasize that too. I understand that medieval Europe is not encompass all of the medieval world, but that's primarily my area of focus. And in medieval Western Christianity, women couldn't be priests. They mostly couldn't have that role. But the reason they couldn't have that role wasn't the same as the reason women can't lead today in complementarian churches. In medieval Christianity, the reason women couldn't be leaders in the church was because the medieval world believed that women's bodies were flawed, that women were actually they building on the Aristotelian Greco-Roman world. They believed that there was something wrong with women's bodies, that they were imperfect men, and therefore they couldn't be, these spiritual leaders. Now, the medieval world, however, there was a loophole. I always talk about this, and the loophole was that gender wasn't as fixed in the medieval world as we have it. Part of modernism is binaryism, and we think much more binary than people used to in the past. And in the medieval world, women could forsake their sex and begin to be more like men, and they could wield the authority of men. And so this is why monasticism was so significant for women. This is why we get women preachers like Hildegard of Bingen, who went on preaching tours, and she preached to major ecclesiastical figures. And when they wrote to her and listened to her sermons, nobody quoted Paul at her. Nobody said women can't preach or teach. Instead, they said, "Oh my gosh, that was such an amazing sermon. Will you send it to me?" Um, but the reason they could do this was because of this loophole. And part of the reason that the medieval world knew that women could preach, teach, and lead was because they had biblical examples of women preaching, teaching, and leading, like Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
And the medieval world believed that Mary Magdalene was the apostle to the apostles. They believed that it was significant that Jesus gave his message first to a woman. Another reason I like Dorothy L. Sayers is because she was a medieval scholar. And so I
Mm,
actually think that a lot of her work is influenced by reading medieval texts.
yeah.
And so this emphasis, and in the medieval world also put much more emphasis on the fact that even though Jesus was a man, he came to the world through a female body.
Mm,
And this was sort of, this is God's emphasis on the importance of both sexes. Just because Jesus was a man doesn't mean that men are more important than women, because God had to use a female body to bring Jesus here. And so we miss that. We don't
Yeah.
focus on the fact that Jesus, or when we do focus on the fact that Jesus came through a body of a woman, we often reduce Mary to this young teenage girl who does. I mean, it's the way we picture her is just crazy. Um, but nonetheless, so I think that. And I actually just lost track of what you were asking me. I started thinking about Mary.
Yeah, no, we were just talking about medieval Europe and how the
Oh,
household
that's
relationship.
right. I remember now. Okay, thank you. That's a problem with having people like me on, is that, we're thinking of too many different things. But
So much history in your brain.
yeah, so after in Western Europe, and we've all just been through a pandemic year, so we understand how this happened. But 14th century Europe was a really bad time. I don't know why they put all of the major movies and books about medieval Europe. They put them in the 14th century. And I'm just like, that's the worst time that anybody would want to live, because horrible things happened,
Yeah.
including the Black Death, where 1/3 to 1/2 of the Western European population died. And this caused a restructuring of medieval society. It wasn't a golden age for women, but we do see women beginning to move like out of towns and villages and into cities and taking on more urban work. We also see, a lot of the sort of like ordinary people are able to move up in the society of Europe, because they suddenly can own land, because all those old landowners are dead. And so, I mean, just things like that, we see this changing in the household structure, in the social structures. With this also comes anxiety. And by the time we get to the end of the 15th century and moving into the 16th century, there's a lot of social anxiety, because as people are moving more to cities and villages and you don't know your neighbors as much, sort of it's like, well, how do we now control society? How do we now order society? And we begin to see language entering in, that really the way society should function, it should function like a household, where you have a clear leader and you have clear people who are underneath the leader. And so, the kingdom of England should function like a household, where the king is the lead, is the father, and caring for, and England is his child. And so we get this language, and this also coincides in Europe with, especially in Germany, and I talk about this in the book. And I don't want to bore you. I mean, this is I think I talk about it in a way that I don't lose too much attention. Um,
I don't
but
find it
none,
boring at all.
yeah. So I always worry when I start talking about economic history. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm losing my audience. But essentially, the household became more important,
Mm,
not because of the Bible, but because of European society.
yeah.
And this is picked up in the 16th century, with the Reformation. Sort of the Reformation, this holy household, um, worked really well with Reformation theology. And so what we saw is that essentially, whereas in the medieval world, women could do lots of different things and be godly. And in fact, the best thing a woman could do in the medieval world to be the most godly was to give up being a wife and a mother and dedicate her life solely to God.
Yeah.
After the Reformation, this changes. And the best thing a woman can be is a wife and a mother under the authority of her husband. So the subordination of a wife becomes Christian after the Reformation era. And this kind of continues to grow in steam. And so we kind of get, by the 19th century, it's full blown in what we call the cult of domesticity.
Yeah.
So,
It's fascinating. I think a lot of us don't know that. And until I read you wording it that way in your book, and I've heard you talk about it as well, it wasn't quite solidified in my mind how all those things were happening
mm,
around the same time and influencing each other, and how it's so portrayed as just this very, based on scriptures today. But in fact,
right.
there was so much else going on. And I know for me, like, of course, of honor to all the reformers who did the hard work that needed to be done in so many areas, and we do owe them a great debt for that. Although a lot of people would say all these years later, now we're needing another one in the church. So that
Yeah.
I'll leave that to the people who want to decide that or not. But the reality is, even just having read a lot of what Martin Luther was saying at the time, and even John Calvin and that kind of thing, like I did notice a huge difference. Even, and I mean, with both of them, there's serious concerns around women and the way that was
Right.
interpreted. But I did notice even a big difference in Martin Luther, who seemed to love his wife and kind of include her theologically because they'd both been so involved in the church. But then some of the things that John Calvin says about women, I found very disturbing and very almost filled with hate toward women. And I was very surprised by even just the threads that came out of Calvin, even till today. Some of that seems to still be in that like movement. But you know, the reality is we're all a mixture of good and bad. And I think that's
Right.
history, right? We can
That
be
is.
right on a lot of things and be completely wrong on something else, right?
No, you're I mean, if you think about Luther, and one of my good friends at Baylor is a Luther scholar, and one of the arguments that he makes is that Luther treats women much more badly, and I mean, well, anyway, he treats them worse. I didn't use the right word there, but he treats them worse until he gets married. And then he actually, kind of becomes nicer towards women. And
Yeah.
so it's kind of interesting, this lived experience. But at the same time, we do see, I mean, what we see with the Reformation is we see a world that has already started having harder gender roles towards women. And instead of reformers, looking at the Bible and being like, oh, well, these we don't see these hard gender roles in the Bible. Instead of what they do is they see the Bible as reinforcing the culture around them. And I mean, this is the same thing we do today.
Yep.
We often look at the Bible and we look for, and we assume things about people in the Bible because it sounds like us, and so we
Mm,
picture them like us, when
yeah.
actually it's not all like us.
No.
So, that's what the reformers did. What's funny about Reformation theology, and I think I write this in the book, is that really Reformation theology should have set women free because it
Yeah.
says that women are spiritually equal to men. And
Mm,
this is not what we saw in the medieval world. Well, in the medieval world, it said there was something wrong with female bodies. And so, in order for women to become spiritually equal with men, they had to give up their bodies. And in fact, one sermon text that's just always stuck with me, it says, "Women and God be men." And so this sort of idea that women they can gain spiritual authority, but it's by becoming more like a man. Reformation world, that goes away. Women are accepted and are actually part of God's plan. They're not flawed men. They are human, just like men. But because of the patriarchal world, women don't get set free. And
wow.
in fact, Reformation theology begins to bend itself around that patriarchal world,
Mm,
which says that women are under the authority of their husbands. And this is when we start seeing the household codes, which we find in Ephesians and
yeah.
in Colossians and Peter and Titus and Timothy. This is when we start seeing them preached against women. They weren't really preached against women, not nearly to the scale that they began to be in the 16th. Really, the 17th century is really when it picks up, the 17th, and from that point forward.
Fascinating, right? Because a lot of people would believe those household codes for 2,000 years have been exactly the way we see them today in the white evangelical
Mm-mm.
church or wherever people are reading
Yes.
that lens from.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so let's talk about some of the women from church history that inspire
Mhm.
you that we may not have heard about that really go against this idea that women have always just had to be silent and not really involved. And, that's been our 2,000-year history.
Yeah. Gosh, there are so many. I mean, that's one of the things I teach women history classes at Baylor, and it's so fun because seeing my students learn about these women that they've just never heard of before.
Yeah.
In the book, one of my favorite women, and she is, yeah, I talk about her in the book, but she also is, as I said, my favorite woman, and her name is Marjorie Kemp,
Yep.
and she is just, I always say that she's my favorite medieval woman, but I don't think I would want to be her friend. Because she's extremely dramatic, and I think everywhere you went with Marjorie, she's causes a scene. So, I mean, she's a woman that everybody knew was in the area. But Marjorie believed that God called her. She was a mom, she had 14 kids, and she believed that God called her to pray for the world and to care for the world. And so she buys her husband essentially out of the marriage. I mean, it's this great sort of thing. She essentially says, "Well, you let me be," they're still married, but she no longer owes him the conjugal debt. She no longer has to live with him. And she buys herself out of the marriage. She becomes a vowed woman, and she starts traveling the world, really going to all the holy sites and praying for other praying for people, sort of becoming a quasi saint in some ways. And one of the things that Marjorie does is she stands up for herself that God called her. And there's this really dramatic scene where she's called before the Archbishop of York, and I talk about it in the book. And I teach. I just love teaching this passage because essentially somebody quotes Paul at her and says, "You can't preach because you're a woman." And Marjorie looks at him and says, I can preach because Jesus gave leave for women to preach. And she actually quotes a passage in Luke where this woman in a crowd calls out with a loud voice to Jesus and says, "Blessed is the woman who gave you birth." And Jesus looks at her and says, "Blessed are those who hear the word of God and do it." And Marjorie says, "I hear the word of God and do it," just like Mary. That's Mary who heard the word of God and did it. And so um, Marjorie Kemp says, "Jesus, God authorizes me to speak." And the Archbishop of York says, "Okay." And she gets off. And in fact, the Archbishop of York gives her a letter that says, "This woman's not a heretic, so don't try to burn her at the stake,"
Wow.
and sends her out. And so, I mean, it's just this, it shows us that women have always felt called by God. And that even when the human structures of the church say that they can't do what God's calling them to do, women still do what God calls them to do. And I mean, this is one of the things we can see on the mission field too. Although, I mean, there's all sorts of stories from there. So, and one of the stories I tell in the book too is a woman that I actually didn't know until a couple of years ago. And it was when I was doing I dabble in local Baptist history, mostly because we have great archives here at Baylor that talk about women. I mean, that talk about the Baptist church and the Baptist history. And what I found is that in the early 20th century, there's this whole wealth of ordinary women, Baptist women who are preaching.
Yep. It's what we
And
don't talk about anymore. Yeah.
and it's crazy because, and they're being called by churches
Yeah.
to come and serve. They're mostly not senior pastors, if we
Right.
can use that phrase, but they're evangelists.
Yep.
And they're called by men to come and preach their revival services.
Yes.
Or,
You
I
talk
mean, it's,
about Mrs. Lewis Ball, right?
yes,
Yeah. Like, I'm
yeah,
going to read actually that quote in your book. I think I have it. You say, okay, here it is. In June 1934, the deacons met at First Baptist Church Elm Mott, an old Southern Baptist congregation near Waco, Texas. They voted unanimously to invite Mrs. Lewis Ball of Houston to come as their revival preacher. The deacons recommended, and you quote, Mrs. Lewis Ball of Houston to come and assist us one week during our coming revival. She being a great inspiration to young people, Mrs. Ball has been exceptionally successful as a soul winner. And, this is what, 1934. But in the
yes.
Southern Baptist churches nowadays, a lot of, people may not know that there's such a long legacy of women that has been kind of whitewashed out. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, the sermon that she preached is it well with your soul, which is great too, because it's a play on a hymn that everybody would have known. And, all these people were saved at the end of the sermon. And she was so successful that they invite her back 2 more times to come and be their evangelist speaker. So, there are all these ordinary women in throughout church history who have heard God call them and have led and preached and teach, no matter what people call it, they
Yeah.
have done it.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the amazing things. Another story that I always like to tell, I didn't tell this one in the book because I couldn't figure out how to get her in. But there's this woman in the early medieval world whose name is Winifred, and she's actually from Wales. And where I do most of my research in England is in the southwestern part. It's actually in the Midlands, the Western Midlands, and so I work on the border of Wales, and so a lot of my research kind of falls into the Welsh world too. And so Saint Winifred she became a saint in England, but she actually started off. She's from Wales. They kind of took her into England, but she actually how she became a saint was that she had felt called by God and wanted to dedicate her life to God. And there was a preacher in the area who saw the calling on her and was supportive of it. And a local man decides that he doesn't want her to be called, that he wants to marry her. She refuses, and he cuts off her head.
Oh
I
my
mean,
God.
it's this horrible story.
Wow.
But what's amazing about it is her head like rolls down this hill. I mean, this is a great story. Her head rolls down this hill. Every place her head touches, springs of water come out. And when her head gets down to the bottom, it actually rolls into a sermon that this preacher is preaching, who supported her. And he's so, he runs, he curses the man, and the man gets swallowed up by hell like immediately. And then he puts her head back on her body and he prays and God restores her. And for the next 15 years, she preaches and teaches,
Yeah.
and she becomes a saint in that area. And so, I mean, it's this crazy, but it's, women have always preached, even if St. Winifred's head wasn't cut off,
Even if the details
nonetheless.
are not quite there.
Yeah, yeah, but we have, these stories about women who have fought against systems that tried to tell them they can't preach, teach, and lead, and they have felt God calling to do them anyway. And these women, Marjorie Kemp, Christine de Pizan is another woman. What they often do is they justify their reason to preach, teach, and lead based upon biblical women who preached, teached, and led.
Yeah.
And so they will often quote an early women stories that they heard, like Saint Perpetua, who you mentioned. They
Mm.
said, because these women did it, God authorizes us to.
Yeah. Such a long and beautiful legacy. And I mean, I know that people, whether it's in the Bible or just in any other historical, record or narrative, people are just people. People are complicated.
Yes.
People are a mixture of good and bad. And that's how we are today too. But what's unacceptable to me is rewriting the stories of women in the Bible to
Yep.
whitewash people like Deborah, who was strong and like gave us such a legacy and has been reframed in ways that are it makes you sad because it makes
It
them
makes you
seem smaller.
very
And even
sad.
just like Mary, like you mentioned, right? It's like a pregnant theologian. Why don't we describe her that way instead of, you know what I mean?
I know the Magnificat. I mean, if you think
Yeah,
about the theology embedded in the Magnificat, I mean, it's amazing.
it
But
is amazing. And was
we
banned
were, yeah,
in Guatemala for a period of time because of the power of the Magnificat to really call a government to be good to its people. And when a government
yes.
is destroying its people, nobody wants to hear the Magnificat, right?
No, that's exactly right. And it's funny because we fight against the social gospel, what we call the social gospel, and I'm like, well, that's what Mary said.
I know. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, we read the Bible through a lens, all of us. We're currently, if you're in the United States and you're reading whatever English translation in the year 2021, you're reading through a lens. You're reading through your own
right.
perspective in a pandemic and, shelter in place or whatever you're doing. Like, that's just the thing, right? And so I think the more we understand that, the better we can, look for other perspectives throughout history to give us a better understanding of really what this is supposed to be.
Right.
Not I mean, learning from the mistakes of history, but also learning from where we got it right and trying to repeat that. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for all the scholarship that you have put into this, just, years and hours of research in Wales and everywhere else that you've been to give us this book and just your knowledge. It's just so beautiful. I just one last question I want to ask you is, what do you hope we learn from history about women in history that will affect all of our faith communities today and going forward?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, essentially, God has always called women. God has always called women, and women have always responded. And it doesn't matter, like there's one historian that I talk about in the book. Her name is Carolyn Musek. I'm sure most people have never read her, but she has this really beautiful article, as well as this great lecture you can actually watch online, where she says, look, it doesn't really matter, if you call it preaching or not, because these women are preaching. And so, it doesn't, who cares what men define it as? Women are still doing the work of God. And in fact, Beth Moore said something very similar. She said, stop, she said, who cares whether I'm preaching or not? Let's do the work of God.
Yeah.
And I mean, you still need to make sure that women are able to do the work of God. And complementarian limits women and keeps women from doing the work of God. But at the same time, women have always been called by God in the same ways as men. And it doesn't make them, and women from all stages of life have
Mm.
been called to do the work of God. And so I think we just, I really would like women to hear that and to remember that. And if we think about what a biblical woman is someone who hears God and does the will of God. And that's the pattern that we find in the Bible and the pattern that we see in history. So that's what I want women to hear. Um,
Well, that's so good and so inspirational for men and women. It's really, as we look at Genesis, it was never intended for the man to be alone in leadership, as a king, over a government, over a family. Like the work of the world, the work of our faith, the work of just trying to address poverty and peacemaking and all these things, like it was just never meant for just men to do this alone. It's too
right.
important and it's too hard. But you see beautiful examples throughout history and even today of men and women coming together side by side as it was intended in the creation to do this work. And so thank you.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful for this interview today. I'm so grateful just for the voice you have, the way you're teaching young minds at Baylor to dig in deeper, to not accept a surface level of what they've been taught in history, and to question, because in asking
Mhm.
why or why not, that's where we get to the truth, and the truth does set us all free. So thank you for that.
Does.
I pray blessings on you and your academia and your scholarship, and as you teach and as you keep following God's calling on your own life.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Bye, Dr. Barr.
Bye bye.
So good. Oh my goodness. Dr. Barr has done such an amazing work in this book for us, just putting together all of her research. And it's the heart and soul for her. This is a very personal book, all at the same time as she's researching and putting together, her life's work in terms of what she understands the church has been doing all this time related to women and what the Bible actually says. I just want to read a portion of the book where it shows how personal it is for her. She says, in fall 2016, I was teaching one of my favorite graduate courses, a course on medieval sermons. That was the semester my husband was fired from his pastoral job 3 weeks after we had asked the church elders to reconsider their position on women. At first, we were paralyzed. One of our best friends had helped the pastor deliver the verdict to my husband, making it exponentially more painful. Now, instead of a ministry job, we had only severance pay that was dependent on our good behavior, that is, not telling anyone the truth. We had lost our church family and some of our best friends. We were told to walk away from the youth group of about 70 kids whom we loved and had discipled for the past 14 years. Just 3 weeks to completely upend our lives, and we couldn't tell anyone why. It took everything in me to appear normal for my children for that first day. By the time we left my son's afternoon football game, finished homework with the kids, and cleaned up after dinner, I had nothing left. I had already broken down in tears at the football game of one of my Baylor colleagues, simply asked how I was. I just wanted to go to sleep and forget everything for a few hours. But I couldn't. I had a 3-hour seminar the next day filled with graduate students from the history, English, and religion departments. I had to teach. Life didn't stop, especially since we were suddenly a one-income family. And then she talks about preparing a background article that night and reading an article called Prophecy and Song, Teaching and Preaching by Medieval Women. It's by an insightful historian, Carolyn Musig. And she wrote about how Mary Magdalene was preaching the good news to the apostles. And this implication of this feminine exemplar preaching was how it was defined by medieval historians as, yes, she actually indeed was preaching. Mary Magdalene was preaching the good news after the resurrection and was the first one to do so. But because in the medieval times, women's bodies were seen as biologically deformed men and even monstrous, they basically had to find a way for, even though they believed she was preaching, to say that it was just an unusual, situation. And that's when a lot of, light bulbs came on for Dr. Barr, and just, sent her on this quest, which ultimately led to her writing this book. And it's such a gift to all of us, to women, to men in the church, to understand this history, why decisions were made by male clergy at different points, even by women, to kind of rewrite the story of what actually happened in the scriptures and throughout history. So she has given us the truth from her extensive research and scholarship. And she is an academic that has offered us such a favor by giving us a book that's readable for all of us and is really already causing a lot of people to rethink some things. And I hope that if you're in a space of deconstruction at the moment, or if you're just questioning a lot of things, I just encourage you to buy this book. Or if you're just curious to know what she has to say, it's a very well written book. I think you will find it insightful. And she has, proven herself in the academic world to do, very extensive research in this area. So it's a book we all can learn something from. And if you are, like I said, in that deconstruction space, so many people have been there or currently are there. And when you find resources like this, it seems as though for most people, it digs you deeper into your faith. It digs you deeper into the scripture. It strips away the culture, the lens that you've read it through, and helps you understand the situation that actually was going on at the time that these scriptures were written. And throughout her church history, she helps us dig into the culture and the mindset and what people were thinking in a deeper way. So I hope that you will, like many, find her book and her writing to be one step in your journey of discovering what is true and stripping away, these prescriptive lenses of culture that we've been handed. She is certainly a woman who loves Jesus and has a strong faith, and has offered us this book to help us transform our thinking from harmful patterns of patriarchy in the church, society, and even so many things we've absorbed or assumed. It's such a gift. I highly encourage you to go out and get on Amazon or get on wherever you buy your books from and buy this book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood: How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth, by Dr. Beth Allison Barr. It releases tomorrow, April 20th. Oh my goodness, we've all been waiting so long, since March and February and even before, for so many, but I've had my hands on it since March, and it will not disappoint. Releases tomorrow. Order it today and just read and read and read, and then let me know what you think. Next week on the podcast, we have Tiffany Bloom. She has written a book that also has a lot of attention lately. Tiffany is East Indian born, but lives in the Pacific Northwest. And she's an author, a speaker, a podcaster of the podcast Why Though with Ashley Abercrombie. She's an adoptive parent. She's passionate about truth, justice, and the restoration of marginalized people groups. And her book, Pray Tell, is about abuse in the church and whistleblowers and women being discredited as whistleblowers, and just so many things. You're going to love hearing what she has to say. She is a person who goes after truth and does it in a way that's honest and caring and loving, and it ultimately is about setting us all free. And she's paid a big price to do that. She loves her faith community. She's helped start some things up in Tacoma, Washington, where she lives, to gather people around conversations regarding faith that are really cool and exciting, and hopefully she'll talk about some of those. But check out Tiffany Bloom and her book, Pray Tell, before next week, and I'm sure you'll be just as excited as I am to listen to this episode. Have a great week, everyone. Bye. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.